It's time for our sadly last panel. I'm happy to welcome our third and final panelist for the day, Alexander Wales, the author of similarly to Raven's Dagger, numerous stories, including but not limited to Glim Warden, Shadow of the Limelight, Thresholder, most recently, and then the also recently published stories. This used to be about dungeons and famously long and in-depth Worth the Candle, his D&D amalgam kind of story, if I'm
Yeah,
getting it right.
it's a D&D lit RPG kind of. It's I might go so far as to call it a deconstruction of the lit RPG stuff, but I don't know. I get that question a lot if it's a deconstruction kind of. But yeah, that one is pretty old now. That was started in 2016 and finished in 2020, I think, something like
Mhm.
that.
Yeah, and you've been writing, so I was looking through some of your one-shots as well on your own website, right?
Yeah,
alexanderwells.com. And those were dated back to 2014. And so you've always, I know you had your, you weren't always a writer, but you've been writing for a long time and you've wanted to be a writer for a long time. Is that correct?
yeah. So I actually first started publishing short stories online in 2002 when I was in high school. That was to a GeoCities website, and it was like read by all my high school friends. It was
Mm.
like a readership of like, you know, 20 people. This was back when you had to like make your GeoCities website by manually editing the HTML and stuff. So it's very, very early internet.
Right.
Thankfully, none of that survives because it was all kind of awful. But yeah, then I was a software engineer for 7 years and stay-at-home dad for. I guess I don't know. My son's in second grade now, so I write while he's at school, and writing's full time.
Yeah. So when did the kind of transition happen, and was the transition like conscious, like you like purposeful, or okay, maybe those obviously it was, but like was it planned in
Yeah, so I started. It was around 20, like end of 2013. I was publishing some like fan fiction, and I published one called Metropolitan Man, which is like a Superman. It's like a Lex Luthor villain protagonist thing, and got a great response for that.
You wrote that?
Some people hated it. What?
Yeah, I read that like a long time ago. I didn't know you wrote that. That's
Yeah, that's
cool.
me.
All right, cool.
Some people just absolutely hated it for reasons I very much understand. But yeah, I got a good response from that, and I'm like, you know what? I'm just gonna try. I was still doing software engineering, so I wrote some other stuff. I wrote Shadows of the Limelight. I wrote a novella and some other stuff, and then when my son was about to be born, I was like, okay, I'm gonna be a stay-at-home dad, and then I'm gonna try to like devote as much of my free time as I can to writing and to try to making it work, as far as money goes, and not have to go back to pushing code and stuff and scrums and a bunch of stuff I just did not enjoy at all.
Yeah, no worries. And I say on behalf of your fans and readers of your stories that we're all glad that, you were able to make that transition. But 2020, like you've been writing for a long time. So,
Yeah, I mean, seriously, probably since 2016, I guess. Like, but it's kind of one of those things where you start writing and there's like Patreon and stuff, and it slowly goes up enough to just be like a nice bonus, and then eventually you
right, as you get
get enough that you can be like, okay, I can do this full time. So
right, right. And that's probably the common track for web serial authors these days is to build a following either on Road, what have you, mostly Royal Road these days, right? Especially in the RPG genre. But and Reddit is a big one. Humanity F yeah is a
yeah,
big subgenre. I know, yeah, like a few stories that have popped off on Reddit, and but build a following on Patreon, and then maybe join a publishing house or get an agent, and then make your rounds in traditional publishing or transmedia. And Alexander, you've been I really I don't want to use terms like father of a genre, and but you definitely were one of like the first people to start writing in and popularizing the rational fiction genre, right? Alongside, well, I know you've mentioned Harry Potter and the methods of rationality in some of your other posts, and you enjoy Pale Lights, who's by Erratic, who's also a figure in rational fiction genre. Obviously, Wild Bow. Would you consider Wild Bow a rationalist fiction writer?
I've had that debate a lot. I think Worm had a lot of elements of what. So there's the subreddit, which is /r/rational, which started in 2013. I wrote a lot of like fanfic right when that came out. I'm a mod of the subreddit because I used to run. We used to have like a weekly short story challenge thing or bi-weekly, whatever. I used to run that. Yeah, it's one of those things where I think a lot of people really like consistency in their fiction and they like seeing characters think through things. I think Worm has a lot of that, has a lot of like cleverness and a lot of like stuff that's really thought out, and then you get like the answer to a question that the work has sort of posed in the background later on, which feels really satisfying and stuff. It's one of those. Yeah, I've spent way too many words debating people about like genre definitions and
Well,
stuff.
you have one here, right? If I may, in your AMA, sorry for the claim, but you noted in Reddit post, let's see, your definition of rational fiction is ultimately a fiction that encourages you to think either about the subjects that it raises or the fiction itself.
Mhm.
And I found that to be true with, a lot of your works that I've enjoyed, very interesting. Like I myself am a fan of rational fiction, having read Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality, works by Erratic, works by yourself. But you go on to note that if there ever was a war to define the term of rational fiction, it
Yeah,
might be one that you lost. So maybe
yeah.
this is your definition, but maybe not what you think that it's come to mean. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that and maybe talk about what it's come to be defined as instead.
I think for the first and foremost definition is just like stuff that we like, right? And that's the best way of knowing whether it belongs like in the subreddit or in the genre, or like whether people lump it into the genre is whether or not they like it. But I think a lot of it is a focus on sort of this internal consistency and world building and characterization. There's a lot of stuff that happens in stories where specifically a character will do something out of character to move the plot along, or something will happen because that's what needs to happen for the plot to continue. And it's kind of bad writing, or sometimes it's surrealism, sometimes it's just genre conventions and stuff like that. But that's what a lot of people think of rather than it being about fiction that rewards thought, which is my definition. So I kind of think that the other definitions is what most people will associate with rational fiction.
I see. So yeah, I see what you're saying.
So like a really popular story is super supportive. It's like popped off on Royal Road and doing super well on Patreon and stuff. And it's posted to that subreddit, and I think that people just sort of accept that. I would not define it as rational fiction, but it has been written with a lot of love and a lot of care and a lot of obvious planning and stuff. So that's sort of what people value more, and I think is sort of more important at this point. It's hard to say. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a pretty big group of people, and it's very spread out now. It's very kind of all over the place. So I also don't like go on like space battles or sufficient velocity, where I'm sure they have their own fights over terminology. So
It's really cool. I mean, I'm probably more of a traditionalist too in terms of rational. I also didn't understand a lot of Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality. There are sections that go into, these really deep philosophical rationalist
yeah,
almost monologue. I mean, so a lot of it is very enjoyable. I've read it multiple times. I've read your stories multiple times, just to kind of like for the mental food for thought, like thinking juice that it provides. So I really do love that aspect of rationalist fiction, and yeah, I can understand your sentiments. But has that similarly with HPMR, where like the author is like, do you think as an author you put your own thoughts and worldviews? Like, how do you like, so HPMOR was kind of like this cry of like philosophical, like
Yeah.
humanity. It had elements of humanity, yeah, like in there as well. But for yourself, how do you contain like, because you contain a lot of like different philosophies in even one book, and for Dark Wizard, for example.
Yeah. I think for me, I try to pick perspectives that I can understand really well and just spin them out, and so it's for me, a lot of writing compelling characters is trying to contain that model of them. And so you have these two characters that are different models of sort of how the world works and what we value and stuff like that, and seeing the ways that they come into conflict with each other. I think so. Worth the Candles was it's like 1.6 million words. It's got a whole lot of philosophy and discussion and digressions and tangents and stuff. But most of the discussions that people have over the nature of the world and like power and creation or stuff are things that I feel contained within me. I think that's the easiest way to write for me is to sort of think about it in that way. But it's also, I don't know. I think one of my strong suits as a person is having a lot of empathy. And so, I've argued with a lot of people on the internet. That used to be my hobby. And
your blog post about that.
And every time I try to put myself in their shoes and I try to see myself like, okay, let's say that I was having this idiotic political position or whatever, right? I would always try to think to myself, what must the world look like to them? Like what? And I try to synthesize it, and I try to incorporate a model of it or an understanding of it. And so that's helpful a lot with writing, especially I like my villains, and I like them to have a point. And I think that's part of what I enjoy about writing a villain is that I want them to have at least for me to feel like I understand them. I think the hard part is sort of getting that across to the reader because I also don't like my villains to monologue that much. I don't like them to just like, it's easy for the protagonist because we're in their head, right? And it's easier for their friends because they'll have these long discussions with them. But for a villain, it doesn't make as much sense for them to like get that stuff across.
Right. And I feel like that's a really, brought to that writing philosophy is brought to the fore with your Thresholder book.
Yeah.
No spoilers really, but it's kind of like a story where the protagonist gets recruited into this multi-dimensional war, and this mysterious power kind of maybe not forces, but like allows him to jump through worlds and always meet his philosophical kind of like an enemy that he's gonna have a philosophical disagreement with.
Yeah.
And I see that like we see the protagonist's school of thought or reasons for thinking the way he does, but we don't. Sometimes we get the way for example the book 3 with where he jumps into this Chinese cultivation world. We don't see a lot of his. Well, we do get the villain's like own storytelling time, but we didn't get that for his book 1. But I feel like that's a really interesting way to like kind of contain different philosophies, and maybe like the world is a polarizing place with a lot of people split into two groups largely. And but with your story, I feel like with Thresholder, I feel like there's the villain, but the villains are very interesting and human in the sense that they're not.
I actually think that is like to some extent a weakness as far as like Royal Road readership goes, because I think especially book 1 is it's like an urban fantasy book, and he's going up against Cosme, or I don't know, my pronunciation is
He's your character,
horrible, but
that's how you want.
Yeah, so he's going up someone who has like an understandable outlook, right. And they wouldn't necessarily, if they had met under different circumstances, they wouldn't necessarily be on the opposite side of each other. And I think that's the kind of moral complexity that a lot of people don't like, especially in something that has like all these other elements of power fantasy, right?
Right.
I think it undercuts the power fantasy a little bit, but I like writing that stuff. I like undercutting the power fantasy, which is I have that sort of triumph of the perverse as an author, where I sometimes am just like, hey, you know what? Let's just take a left turn a little bit, or at least like lean into the weird stuff that is sort of outside the expectations of the genre.
Mhm. Yeah, and I really liked your take on the Chinese cultivation. I mentioned before, and like Chinese web novels has a big influence on our own
Yeah.
industry, right? But your take on Chinese cultivation was like really awesome because it's so different and like but in a way that makes sense and it covers some of the basics and I do recommend that the story in this book to fans of Chinese cultivation and readers and authors alike, I think. And I love Chinese web fictions too, but they suffer from very stratified. Like that's like the pro and con of like an industry that's really established with so like most Chinese cultivation systems share the same system.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that's a strength of us, well, including myself, a Korean American, Western English speaking audience and readers, like, rationally, we they don't have they do have subgenres in Korean, Chinese, Japanese light novels, but not nearly the same breadth of diversity of thought, of genre that we have here. And
I at least part of Worth the Candle was inspired by having read most of The Gamer, which was a
oh yeah, very popular Korean web.
very popular, very, very early RPG, like one of the first very popularized.
It was foundational, yeah.
Yeah, very foundational. But I had read most of that, and I was like, I could do this, but mine's going to be like different,
Sure.
and there's a lot of stuff that I don't know this is the main thing that will get me to write a novel is that I read something and I'm like, that's not how I would have done it. So I mean, I enjoyed it. I don't think it's bad. I don't think I finished it, but like I will watch a movie or I will read a book and I'll just be like, I would do this a different way, and then I will sit down and just write a whole bunch to try to exercise those demons.
Right. And that's similar to what Raven mentioned as well as like kind of like the shared experience for maybe not all readers, but maybe a lot of authors where they'll read a book and like maybe like Loki said, like out of maybe not out of spite, but like the desire to take their own
Yeah.
spin on it, this creative urge. And I think that's something that's really awesome and beautiful and great for a lot of people who want to read. And honestly, I think books, and this is something that I wanted to ask maybe all of the panelists, maybe I should have asked this while Selkie was here, but something I wanted to ask was like, what is writing to you and what kind of authors do you guys see yourselves as? And like what do you want your readers to like think about and feel? Because I like rationalist, even lit RPG like that, like are killing monsters and stuff. I think the most successful web fictions always have they leave an strong emotional aftertaste after you have read a book. I've One Piece has made me cry multiple times. But the Gamer, for example, I didn't finish because it's just like exists to self-perpetuate itself, and that's not like a bad thing necessarily, but all good stories must come to an end, and I feel like most good stories tend to be self-contained, and if like they can leave loose questions, right? Like Inception, like leave off on like they don't have to like have some sort of like clear ending, but you can't you don't get bored of a really good story. You want to finish it, you feel better for it. And I guess I would love to get your thoughts on that too. I'm not completely right. I'm not right at all. I don't have to be.
Yes. I think for me, I always, when I start a work, I try to think about what its central theme is, or what its central question is going to answer is, and then try to revolve everything around that as much as I can. There is a thing that I think it was Wildbow said that I read like ages ago, that I thought was really good writing advice, which is that if you do consistent characterization, then your themes are going to follow from that. So I kind of tried to do that a little bit. Like if you have a character who's just like really insecure, then your theme is going to be insecurity. If you write consistent characterization, you know. But I do try to do theme first, and try to pick out at least something that I can sort of revolve plots around or revolve characters around, because I think that makes a more cohesive and better work. And then I tried to have the endings have as much stick to them as I can, as much like the ideal for me for a novel is that you have a bunch of threads that all come together like right at the end. But like writing web fiction, you're sort of incentivized to go long because you get more followers, you get more likes and whatever. It does better in the algorithm. There's word of mouth, and then every time I start a new serial, I'm like, okay, I'm not going to get everyone on board from the last one, especially if I'm hopping genres, right? So like this used to be about dungeons, was a follow up to Worth the Candle. Worth the Candle gets very dark. This used to be about dungeons is like 90% cozy fantasy with like maybe 10% dungeons. And it's like found family. The central theme is something like trying to find your purpose in life, right? It's like a very young adult. It's not written as a young adult thing, but it's sort of that phase of life of trying to find what you're doing in life and stuff, and the found family stuff and people's expectations. And then the one after that is Thresholder, which is, you know, much more brutal in a lot of ways. And then the sort of central theme that I'm trying to revolve around is power, like questions of power and who has it and what they do with it. And that's sort of the well that I keep going back to. And I hope that by the end of finishing Thresholder, people will at least be thinking about those things or have had some thoughts about those things. Mm-hmm. But I don't know, people get out what they want to get out of things. And so I try to not be too firm in like having a lesson. It's more of a discussion between sometimes these different parts of myself or these different ways I have of thinking of different things.
Do you find that that process enriches your own, you know, like character, enjoyment of life, like taking these different evolving perspectives, or kind of get like
so it's like I said, I think empathy tends to be a strong suit for me, and empathy is also something you have to work on because sometimes other people just seem like idiots, like especially on the internet where it's coming across as like a single line of text and that's all you have to judge their entire person by, you know. And it's so easy to just read a single line of text from someone and think that is the dumbest person in the world who just messaged me. So I always have to work to like step back and be like, no, maybe they're just having a bad day, you know. Maybe they're trapped in some toxic stuff and this is their way of letting it out, you know, or whatever. So I think it does enrich me in that sense because I am always trying to find the different perspectives, and that's through writing something I practice every day.
Yeah, and I think good stories do their part in kind of allowing people to take a step into other people's shoes. It's like, you know, when we read about somebody going through pain, a part of our brain that, you know, is responsible for pain gets activated too, right? So I feel like, yeah, like stories overall, like hopefully contribute to, you know, we're exposed to a lot of like sometimes negative, pessimistic thoughts about where the world and America is going, which is why, you know, I really do, but I do think that like stories, you know, they don't have to just be escapists. They can be enriching and educational, like you know, and empathetic, teach empathy, and in science fiction, like as I've mentioned, my favorite author Isaac Asimov, he used to describe science fiction writers as like scouts for the future, where they use their imagination to go and look at the world 10, 20 years in the future if we don't fix this, or, you know, if we don't do that. And that's the same for Brave New World, like, you know, classics like Brave New World and 1984, I think that's if I'm getting the numbers right. So yeah, I think it's really cool to see this new community of web fiction authors and bring various strengths and various forms of entertainment. And it is like, while it is entertainment, I think the word entertainment doesn't have to carry this bad connotation. It can be, you know, very rational, can be very cozy. And yeah, like I think questions of power are also really important too in this, because we, you know, it's just the fact that we're speaking in English English is a very powerful language, right? Because so many people use it for various things. I don't want to get carried off topic, and I want to be mindful of the time. So that's about almost the time that we had, and I would like to spend the next 5 minutes opening up the floor to questions or any, closing remarks from Alexander and Raven's Dagger, and also just I would love to get your thoughts on, what writing is to you guys, as I mentioned, and what kind of authors you guys would like to be, and what your goals are in this industry that's changing with AI and
Oh boy,
competition.
that's a can of worms right there.
Right. Yeah. I'm sorry to
Yeah.
hear that right at the end.
No, no, it's good. It's good. I remember several years ago. I don't know if you were around back then, Alexander. Yeah, you were definitely no, sorry. You were definitely around back then. But like pre 2000s, right? Like pre-COVID, not pre 2000, sorry, pre 2020s basically. There was like a lot of discussion about like AI in writing. And that was like before GPT-2 launched. And like the only kind of AI written stories at the time were stuff like the Harry Potter and a Pile of Ash, I think it was called.
Yeah.
And it was like absolutely absurdist, nonsensical stuff, right? And I remember being part of a lot of like rational discussions at the time about like the future of writing and artificial intelligence. And at the time, there was a lot of like a lot of people said that like AI would never be able to write a story because stories have human soul in it, right? I never really agreed on that point because how do you quantify that? And now we're at the point where we're at the threshold where AI can write very competently, right?
Yeah.
They're it's quite good even in some respects. Grammatically, it's definitely better than any one of us in terms of like sentence structure and so on. It's not bad, but like it's in terms of like long term composition where it fails. But that's something that could be rectified.
Yeah. So I have some blog posts on my website where I've been trying to write a novel using AI, and there are some
I've
methods. There are
I've
some
done one as
methods that
well. Yeah,
yeah, there's some methods that you can use to try to enforce structure on it, like in terms of having it. I don't know. It's very difficult and frustrating to try to get its individual like scenelets to stitch up with each other. But I think that's going to be
yeah.
a solved problem,
It's
within the
going to be
next 5 years,
solved very
certainly.
soon. Like 5 years seems like a long shot,
Yeah.
actually. I played a little bit with GPT-3 back in 2021. I knew a guy from a university that had access to it, and I was able to feed it like the entirety of like instead of like full training data, I was able to feed it like only my stories as training data, and I was able to tell it, hey, generate like an entire novel length. So it took quite a long time for it to churn, but it was able to churn out a full 100,000 word story. And I read through it, and like it was there was like long scenes of like nonsense and like everything else. It was like like it wasn't great. The writing wasn't great, but also it cost me like 20 something dollars to feed that back then. But yeah, but it was like, oh, okay, there's clearly a future here. This is going to grow, and I'm not sure what to think about it. I'm not sure if I should be worried or not. Definitely on the like the financial side of things, yeah, that's it's more competition. You can't really outcompete a machine. At the same time, I think you'll have experienced this as well, Alexander, where a lot of the reason people read our stuff isn't necessarily because our stuff is not because it's not well written, but because people suggest the work to others, right?
Yeah.
Like stories are meant to be shared. And the reason why we read some stories are because we want to be part of the people that are sharing in the experience of those stories. So when you mention, "Oh, I read this," I can go, "Oh, yes, I also read that. I know what you're talking about. We have a shared reference
Yeah.
for discussing other things." So when Edward mentions like Asimov, I've read like 30 Asimov books, you know? So if he says, oh, blah, 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 and he mentions like Dreaming of Electric Sheep or something like that, I can say like, oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. He's probably read Heinlein and like other things. I can mention that. So we have a shared history there. You've mentioned a lot of Ratfic. You've read Worm. You've read HPMOR by Yitkowski. I think that's how you pronounce his name. And like other things that we've read these things in common. We have a shared point of reference and like, okay, so the reason you would read those stories isn't just to enjoy the stories themselves, but also because people in your community have read them. And I don't think the AI will necessarily encroach upon that aspect of writing, the social aspect of it, right?
Yeah.
Where where the big reason we have readers is because we're sharing content.
I think people also like the personal aspect. They like, especially people who've read you for a while, or even people who are just reading like one longer work. They're like, okay, I am getting insights not just into these characters and this world, but into the author. I'm like, that's part of why you have to be like kind of a decent person, because otherwise people will be like, this author,
A bit
Worth
of a
Candles
jerk, yeah.
was at least partly autobiographical, and I know people enjoyed that aspect because they're like, oh, I'm getting inside your head. And that is something you could never have with a computer. I think you could have the social aspects. I think in the future there's going to be like stuff that's well written enough by the AI that people will just share that stuff, and there'll be like cultural touchstones, at least in small communities, where people are all reading, the same AI written works,
Yeah.
or the same curated works. I think you'll get communities like that where they're just sharing the stuff that is actually good or fits their certain niche, rather than everyone making their own bespoke novel that is specific to their tastes. But I don't know.
Yeah.
It's so hard to
I
know.
I think I think there is room for that kind of bespoke novels type thing
Mm-hmm.
as a service, maybe, because there's like there are novel services that are very similar. I think it's called Novel AI.
Yep.
And it writes like a couple paragraphs, and then it writes a couple paragraphs, and then it writes a couple paragraphs, and you can tell it to delete and restart. And it's moderately competent. It's not that bad. It loses track of itself after a while, but you could set it on a path and be like, hey, write this type of story about this character doing this thing, and you can tell like they scrape from like AO3 or something, because
Yeah.
you'll mention like a character from like a popular fandom or something, and it's gonna use fandom tropes, and it's like, yes, you've definitely stolen some fan work. But yeah, you can read that type of thing, and I played around with it, but it's like, okay, this is kind of entertaining, but it's not actually as entertaining as reading something that was published by someone.
Yeah.
And you miss out on that shared aspect. So I think on that side of things, we're kind of okay. I think it's going to be a long time before, maybe not a long time, it's going to be a while before AI gets to the point where it can do a full story, the entire thing be completely coherent, and it be like fully enjoyable as a standalone piece.
I think so.
But
My opinion is what we're going to see is we'll see the AI stuff. You'll have novels that are written 90% by AI and then like 10% by a human.
I
And
think
I
that's
kind of think
very
about that
possible.
in
Yeah.
terms of like, I write, I don't know, it's like 12 to 15,000 words a week or something like that. And if I could translate that into like 100,000 words a week by just like wrangling an AI and fixing all its mistakes and being like an editor and a curator of AI content, I don't know. I think I could get out competed by someone doing that, so long as they were a good writer and had good tastes and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's going to be kind of, people integrating AI stuff. There's so much hostility towards AI right now, but I kind of don't think that's going to last. I think
I
eventually you'll have someone who's like a great writer who can like hammer it into place.
I've tried writing a story using a lot of AI assistance called Cozy Core. It's like a dungeon core cozy fantasy thing. And I wrote that one there specifically to test out, hey, let's see how much I can push this AI thing. So I didn't get my community as involved in that story as I do most of my others, because I figured if it goes bad or something, or it upsets people, whatever, it's a loss thing, right? And the current AI's inability to keep track of like previous story beats is a massive deterrent by the time you get 30, 40, 50,000 words in.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, you're completely unable to remember things that happened 10 chapters ago. Then every new story element is like completely new, and like you're pulling things out of nowhere, introducing new characters. It becomes nonsensical. So yeah, it's like, okay, it's not there yet. It's not there yet. You need to outline everything yourself and like give the AI like a significant amount of detail just to get it to write like one chapter's worth of stuff. And by that time, you've spent as many hours doing outlining and so on than you would have done normal writing, and the result is somewhat subpar.
Yeah.
So it's not there yet, I don't think.
That's been my experience. As I spend as much time wrangling the AI as I could have just writing the thing that that I wanted. So I'm like,
Yeah.
well, okay, for me, this does not work. If I were a worse and slower writer, worse and or slower writer, I think maybe it might be starting to make sense. But then, like, even then, I
Oh,
feel like no one's going to want to read that.
it still has its uses. It still definitely has its uses for like stuff like I'm really bad at forgetting words sometimes.
Yeah.
So I'll be like, I cannot remember this one word. I know it starts with a letter and it means this thing. And I know there's a word for that. And you can ask the AI and be like, hey, there's a word that starts with like this sound,
Yeah,
maybe,
I have
and it means that.
I have Claude is my preferred AI assistant. I just have it open in a window for like it's good for like generating random names,
Names are great.
for you know all sorts of stuff. It's great for. It's just not good at the prose. It's not.
It's really good when I'm writing solo for names and stuff. At the same time, my community tends to be fairly active. Like I write everything live. Like my community has access to my G Docs, so they see me writing, and I enjoy that. And I find it's a lot more rewarding for the community if I turn around and be like, hey, I need a name for a character, and
Yeah.
I just let them pick a name. Like even if people come up with something silly, sometimes it just fits, and it's like, all right, that's cool. It's how recently ended up with a clairvoyant character called Clairvoyant. It's like, all right, that's really stupid, but it's kind of funny. So all right, cool. We'll go with that. So yeah, it's like, all right, you get the community aspect, but when there isn't that for you, like especially if you're a new author, you haven't built a community yet, it could be very useful as a kind of writing sidekick. It's also really good at how do I put this? Giving you like direct, immediate feedback.
Yeah.
Like if you need feedback as an author, which obviously you do to improve, you need another author that's at about the same level as you, or near, or better at you in certain things, to be able to tell you, these are the areas where you need to improve. And that's difficult. Like you have to find someone, convince them to read your story. And if you're not a very good writer, that's really difficult. And then you have to have them tell you what are the things you can improve. And the AI can you just give them the story and like, hey, what's wrong with this? Like what could be done better here? And it might not necessarily lead you like directly to like the best results, but it it, it can be a decent like coach ish.
I don't want to interrupt. This has been a fascinating
Sorry.
No worries. But yeah, so it is 11:04, and so I think just like I just want to make some closing remarks, present some stuff, and then officially transition into a free discussion where I'll, give everyone permission to talk if they so choose. I just remind everyone to be polite, but thank you everybody for attending. You guys have made this so much fun and valuable, hopefully, for each other. And I look forward to editing, transcribing, and then posting these panels on YouTube for prosperity. But yeah, thank you so much for attending. And before you guys, we transition, I'd like to just share has become sort of tradition, so just as a small thanks to
Aw,
just little pieces of fan art that I've commissioned for panelists.
that's
So
cute.
for Raven, and then okay, I have to do new share or excuse me, say stop share. Okay, and then so that's for Raven. I noticed you had a lot of actual ravens for your avatar, so I wanted to do a ravenoid, just kind of mix things up. And then for Alexander, this was before I knew you had a beard, but I was going off Patreon picture. But so for those of you who don't know, that's kind of a riff on Alexander's current protagonist and Thresholder, Perry, who has a power armor and a magical sword. I highly recommend the story, as I do the stories of all the panelists who have attended today.